Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the director of the Center for Game Science at University of Washington and the founder of Engaged Learning, Zoran Popovic.
Thank you. So I'm here to tell you about a lot of different things in 30 minutes. Hopefully, my goal is to sort of foster sort of more thinking. Hopefully, if I get you to think a lot more about what we really could be achieving with games and what kind of change we can possibly make, that would be sort of something that I would be very happy about. So I have been sort of transfixed with this idea of what is a transformative change? How can we actually make change that is actually not noticeable on a large scale? Namely, can we change the way we do science? Or even, can we change something fundamental about the way the education is done? Can we transform the way our societies work, right? Is there a particular effects that we can actually produce at that particular scale? And when you start, and I've been doing this for now actually a lot of years, and there are some key obstacles that are pretty large in the way. And there are in the shortest way to describe. The first is scope, right? If you really want to make a transformative change, it's usually of a large scope. And when you think about sort of an interactive, engaging thing like a game, it's very hard for it to be of a large scope. So maybe that's immediately a showstopper of some sort. The second is that any kind of transformative change requires effort over a long period of time. And I don't care how fantastic the game is, even if it's not a serious game, if it's just, think of any game out there. There's nothing out there that's played for 6 months or a year on a consistent basis by people. If it happens for so few people that it would not actually create any critical mass towards something. So the question is, how do we get people to sort of coalesce around something for a long period of time, which really is required if you want to make a big difference? The third issue is that one of real-world synergy, right? So there's this whole sort of imaginary world that we somehow need to connect with stuff that's real and what that means often is that there are many other pieces that require this change, and game by itself cannot do it. So we need to figure out a way how to connect all the pieces together in order to achieve that. Finally, I'm not actually sure that we really know how to truly design interactive experiences towards a specific outcome. And in fact, until we actually achieve that exact outcome. I think that I'll point in this talk in many ways how it becomes a very different design process than the standard game design process in general. And if we look at sort of what it means for science, I can tell you these two domains that I've been working on is scientific discovery and education. And here's what it means in science, basically. So we need to go from a game to a publication to actually noticeable impact on the science, right? With respect to extended time, discoveries require skills. There's no discoveries that somebody can just stumble upon a game and they just kind of happen and we have transformative change. The other aspect is, this game, to really make an impact, needs to be connected with lab experiments, with trials, in a very tight integration system where scientists take it seriously, not individually, but collectively, right? So that's a big challenge. And finally, how do you design for an unknown outcome? Anytime you design for something, maybe you know what you want to achieve, but here, if you knew what the outcome was, it wouldn't be a discovery, right? So you need to design in this open-ended space towards a target that is only loosely defined, and that becomes incredibly hard. Let's look at it in education, right? So now this means it's not enough to just cover one little tiny concept in a partial way. You need to basically cover a year, a semester of content. How can that be possible in this domain, right? And same thing for time. Another way to think of it is if we just focus on students by themselves, turns out, and I've done many studies on this, you can make nearly as much difference as when you integrate teachers and the entire classroom in the process, right? So this is now real-world synergy. If you just think the kids are just going to play by themselves and just become brilliant in any kind of educational concept, it becomes so hard to achieve that without all these other fundamental pieces of the puzzle. And finally, with respect to the outcome, it's not just, anytime you design a game, no matter what it is, you're going to get a subset of the population playing it. And oftentimes that subset is so large that you're fine. You're making millions of dollars, great. I don't care that the other 80% of the population never hates my game. It doesn't matter. But in education, that doesn't work. If you just say, I've engaged 20% of kids and the other ones don't kind of like my game, but maybe they like some other game, that's not good enough. You need to basically have something that engages 95% of the student population. How do you get to that particular point? So, I know, pretty depressing, huh? But is there any hope? And of course, why am I wasting my time on this if it's so hopeless? So I actually think that there is hope. And I don't think that we're necessarily close to some of these outcomes that I'm hoping for. But I think that I think there is an emergence of a system, of a process that could enable us to do this. OK, so how many of you have heard of Foldit? Now that my eyes have adjusted, I can actually see a little bit here. OK, so I'm not going to go through this very quickly. So basically, this is sort of, at the time, the craziest thing we ever attempted. We had a fearless scientist who wanted to try this with us. So we basically figure out, can we solve proteomics? And you've seen Foldit, so I'm going very quickly through this. Fast forward 3 years later, many failures along the way. We had not one, but 3 Nature papers and 1 Proceedings of National Academies of Science. Most of you have probably heard about the protein that has been discovered. It's a monkey HIV virus that scientists worked on for 13 years. They couldn't quite figure out the structure, and the Foldit players did it in 10 days. More recently, we're focusing on design. So these are proteins that don't exist in nature. People have basically created these structures that scientists themselves are starting to sort of marvel and say, could this really be built? Are these actually structures that could be built from proteins? More interestingly, we're actually doing drug design. So instead of designing proteins, we're designing small molecules that attach to proteins such that we can have attack HIV protease, which is a particular different proteins on the outside of the HIV virus, so we can attack tuberculosis, et cetera. And the design is sort of, this is kind of the general thing. The protein still looks the way it does, but here you have this purple and blue little molecule that you're building out of Tinker Toy building sets in such a way that it creates just the right shape to fit the 3-dimensional cavity of the protein. And if you find that out, you have a new generic drug that's not created by pharma, but by people all around the world. I wouldn't say that we're close to that, but this is the direction in which Foldit is going now. The game that I'll announce today is NanoCrafter. It has to do with synthetic biology, namely DNA computing. And in the course of this talk, the natural time to tell you about it is now. However, if I did that, most of you would go on the web and try to play it. So I'm going to do that at the end. But the interesting thing about Foldit, if you look at the top 20 players, this is basically the breakdown of their background in biochemistry. So 3/4 of all of those people had 1 undergraduate course in chemistry, not even organic chemistry, or less. Okay? There was only 2 people professionally involved, and they're at the bottom of that 20% list. To me, that actually was the biggest outcome, because I realized that this expertise development was the biggest thing that we kind of, at that point, stumbled upon. And ever since then, I have been sort of trying to focus on, well, if we can do that, at least to some extent here, can we sort of apply the similar principles to education? And we basically have been doing that for a long period of time. And so I will give you a sense of what I think is actually required to be transformative in education. It's very different than what we're doing now, I think. And so what I'm primarily focusing on is that if you look at the education, it's a very complex system. It's not enough to focus only on curriculum or on a student or teacher development. You need to optimize all of these elements together, because only then will you have the maximal possible effect from the thing. And we're not doing that. It's too complex. Games specifically are not necessarily well suited for this, because they can focus on the person actually playing it, but what does it mean for a teacher? What does it mean for a curriculum? And so we've been developing this engaged learning platform that does several things that are kind of really required if those are the goals that you want to achieve. First, infinite curriculum. So what this means is that there's nothing fixed in the game itself. It has a way to adapt itself infinitely and create just the right nuance of a problem that's deemed suitable for the learner at that particular point of learning. Once we have that, we'd have a huge space over which we can optimize, and not optimize just for mastery, but for engagement at the same time. And if you notice, what I mean by engagement here is very different, because I need them to be engaged. I need them to wake up in the morning and say, oh, I have an idea. I have to go and try this, right? Which is very different than sort of the standard badges and other things that we see today. Then what we do is basically find these optimal pathways that are unique for every student, but also for every teacher, right? So how can the teacher optimally use a game together with instruction and group activities to create the maximal possible outcome that could not be achieved with a game? That's the fundamental question we're trying to understand. And then, of course, we also built a platform around this space. So let me just give you a sense of what I mean by infinite curriculum synthesis. If you think of sort of adaptivity, and this is the case for educational systems, but also for games in many ways, adaptivity is usually gated, meaning you work on some things, and if you get some level of proficiency in it, you get some assessment, and you move on to the next thing. And so that's the way in which things are adapted. But if you really want to design something for the maximal learning rather than maximal assessment, you need much finer scalpel in which to adjust the curriculum with. And so what we basically do is develop a thought process language. So this is something where you can encode how to solve a specific puzzle, how to solve an algebraic equation, or how to, prove a theorem even, if you will, right? And so what we're able to do is generate challenges that develop thought processes, specific thought processes that we're trying to model. We can also create automatic explanations and track players' thinking, because now we have a model of what is the ideal way somebody should think. So, okay, so this is fairly abstract. Let's look at an example of something like this. This is an automatically generated explanation of how you should solve a relatively complex puzzle that includes both spatial difficulty and, in this case, fractional reasoning at the same time in a step-by-step process visually. And what's nice about this is it works for infinite number of problems that we generate, because every one of them has the correct thought process through which somebody should go through, and the explanation is automatically generated. So of course, you wouldn't present this entire explanation for every level. What's nice about this is you can automatically detect where a student has deviated from the sort of reasonable thought process, and then insert just the right explanation that's suitable to sort of create a new light bulb of how they should be thinking instead. Okay, and what I want to tell you about is that when you start thinking of it this way, the design space becomes incredibly large. So this is not a game, but it's a problem, right? Think of this. You need to figure out where to put brackets in order to have this equation do the right thing. And so you have to try a number of things. There's some estimation in your thought process. If you look at the space of all possible problems that are distinctly different in this space, we can automatically generate this is this large, right? So it's very hard for any designer to start to reason about this space. If you zoom into one small region of this graph, you see that these circles are buckets, and they're buckets of identical problems that require exactly the same thought process for students to have. If there's an edge between two things, that means that one problem is strictly a subset or slightly different in some way, slightly easier in some way than others. Right? So what we're able to do is automatically generate this particular scaffolding, and it can work for any kind of game or any kind of learning process. And once we're able to do that, we can say if a learner or a game player answers this problem wrong, then it directly implies unlikeliness that they will actually solve some of those other red problems. So if they solve something correctly here in the green, that it also informs us that all the prerequisites for that they're likely will be able to solve. So this now enables us to automatically explore this space in a data-driven way. What's interesting is that this kind of structure can actually work for word problems in general. So what if we could generate infinite word problems? So imagine a scenario where a learner can pick any kind of context. Let's say you want science fiction, you want medieval warriors, somebody else wants Harry Potter, right? And maybe you create characters, you create actors, you define who's friends with whom, you define who is adversaries, and then you want to learn your entire algebra in that world. Can that be done, right? So basically the algorithms that we've been working on is exactly to do that. So here's one example. We wanted to sort of have kids solve this particular equation in a word problem, and these are the automatically generated problems in the medieval domain that require the student to go through exactly that kind of mathematical reasoning, right? So you can see they're actually fairly rich sort of set of concepts that just, they're endless in some way. But what if I wanted to switch to Harry Potter? This is my daughter's favorite domain. I can tell you she cannot have enough of this. You can also generate things that are now about a dizziness potion that requires flubber mucus, or finding long-forgotten charms, or that top one is the Quidditch, the game, right? So all of this lore of different contexts can now be automatically generated, which allows us to now sort of automatically generate huge amount of word problems, and we're basically designing a game that's going to teach kids how to solve arbitrary word problems. If you know how to read, the assumption is, you should be able to model arbitrary complex mathematical equations from word descriptions. And the question is, can we achieve this in just the right scaffolding through an interactive environment? So that's the first building block. You need to have just the right adaptivity in order to sort of reach 95% of the kids. The second one is that you need to have data automatically adapt your game towards the best possible outcomes. And if you start thinking about what are the dimensions that can vary, it quickly becomes obvious that there are too many things you can vary in this thing. So and this happens when you design games too. If you start thinking about all the things you're not unsure about in your design of the game, it ends up being like a very large vector space where it's pretty hard to figure out what is the right thing to do. So we have a way of figuring out what are the most important small set of dimensions that we should optimize first, and then continue that onwards. So the optimization, basically what it does is, given some state of what student has or game player has done up to now, what is the best thing that should be presented towards maximum learning and engagement in the long run? And here's basically a quick description of how this works. Somebody goes through a pathway. The smiley faces depict how well they do in each problem. And then when you test it on a transfer, this is like, do they really understand it? You realize, oh, whatever we thought in the game actually didn't transfer to reality. So this actually propagates back into the information about all these levels that the student has received. And now we have a new student going through, and let's say the transfer in this case is good. That propagates back. And now the best particular progression for a student is this one, which has not been traversed by any student up to now, right? So we have a way of automatically discovering the best ways to traverse to an enormous sea of huge number of people playing. Why is this important? Well, here's an example. In this case, we're trying to figure out the optimal way to introduce new concepts in a fractional game towards maximal learning. And the zero here is random things. Let's just say if I give them random concepts one after another. And here's what an expert in learning science has designed for students to do. It's worse than random. Okay? It's not because they're not good scientists, it's because they forgot or they assumed that some variables were unimportant that turn out to be essential towards the outcomes. Okay? And it's because that space, as I showed you, is too large. If you look at that highest performing adaptive algorithm, it's significantly, and if you take the best static thing, so that's basically, if you wanted the best textbook, something, or a best game progression that doesn't change, we can take the best static version of that, and that's what this is. And you can see that adaptive is improving it by over 40% in this case. There are many other things that are contradictory unless you actually start to do this data-driven optimization. In this case, you've all heard about, Csikszentmihalyi's sort of growth curve keeping people in the zone as they're playing the game. Everybody's talking about that. But it turns out, in many instances, it could be wrong. Here's one that's automatically discovered. In one particular game, we give people the star as the level difficulty. So they get 0 level difficulty as the first thing. And then basically for the 15% of people who do really well on that one, you give them the hardest possible level, right? Complete violation of proximal zone development, Csikszentmihalyi zone, right? But this is the optimal thing. And then, of course, you actually expect, and what happens is everybody does poorly, and then you give them a level. And then they're going to get much higher retention of people than if you did the standard thing, which is the slow progression that everybody suggests. Okay. Another surprising thing, if you look at sort of secondary effect, these little stars that you collect along the way towards some goal. If you sort of, the assumption is if I add these stars along the way, I'm going to have more people playing. It turns out this is the case. You lose almost 40% of the people yearly unless these stars are directly in line with the main objective of the level of the problem that you're trying to solve. Again, many games are actually losing way more players than they should because they don't follow this. And these are trials with over 40,000 people in random trials. It's kind of, evidence is pretty hard to dispute. Here's another one, hinting. We basically, if you give people these 3 types of hints, they actually increase in abstractness here. How many of you think that 3 is the most useful one? 2? 1? All right, a lot of people would not commit to any, and that's probably the right answer, because the answer is that if presented in a standard way, all of them are harmful. Okay? And that's because there is this particular effect about hints, if they're not necessarily solicited, that makes people feel like they're failing. Okay? That you wouldn't consider otherwise. And again, so you really need to approach it in a very principled way. Otherwise, we make mistakes all over the place like this. Okay. So as I said, learning in the real world, how are we actually including the teacher and the student in this process? So basically, we're not thinking all the games that we're doing now, we're not developing them without all the surrounding entities. So in this case, the teacher actually has a sequence of activities. Some of them are games, some of them are actually descriptions that they simply go through. But now you can actually do more interesting things, like, for example, if you want group activities, you can automatically organize group activities in your classroom where different groups are maybe designing levels and solving levels in the opposite. Or you can do paired work, where every other tablet is automatically blanked, and then the kid is, and a single message appears, say, go play with Nancy, right? So they're playing together towards joint explanation of things, such that later on, individually, they can learn more from that joint play. So now the question is, how do we optimize this whole space of all possible ways in which the game can be combined with all the other real-world classroom activities towards the best possible outcomes? Okay. So the other question is transformative engagement. As I already hinted, we know that these kinds of things they have great effects, but they're spiky. They're very short-lived. So what I'm really looking for is how do we develop kids believing in themselves and thinking that science is something that they self-identify with. And so I don't know how many you know about the growth mindset theory, but if you tell kids you're so smart, it turns out they start creating this fixed mindset. They think that they're somewhere in a fixed place on a Gaussian curve. And no matter what they get, they will always be there, okay? If you tell kids you worked hard, they start developing what's called growth mindset, which means that your function of how good I am at anything is just a function of how hard I struggle and apply myself to. And if you have that, it turns out in these studies, it showed that you actually improve in your performance over time, whereas the fixed mindset, because every time you're faced with an adversity, you run away from it, because you don't want to jeopardize your fixed position on a Gaussian curve, right? You end up decreasing. But the key question always existed is, how do you develop this? And so we have some really good news in this place. It actually can be taught. And in our experiment, we actually had two conditions. Again, many thousands of kids playing here in this particular game, where the experimental condition didn't reward for anything about number of levels solved. It's only about how much you struggle. How many times you have to think outside of the box. How many times you have to try a new hypothesis. Okay? And it turns out, if you have that kind of framework, in fact, if you solve the level very easily, we say, oh, sorry, you didn't add any points here because we didn't give you something hard enough for you to grow your neurons, right? And so in the experimental condition, some shocking results happen. You can basically see ridiculous statistical significance here, but more interestingly, even in the first 30 seconds, you have a completely different change of behavior between people. And more interestingly, if we look at the end of these 30 minutes, we give them something really hard, something we know nobody will be able to solve. And then we look at what happens. And if you look at here in percentages, if you look at these green percentages, these are the people who are struggling on just basic concepts, right? So they're not understanding the key things that the game is trying to learn. But there's way more of them trying to solve this problem nobody can solve than in the standard condition. Okay, so in 30 minutes, we're able to shift their thinking towards the growth mindset. Imagine what would happen if we could do this over the whole semester or over the whole year, right? If you actually valued struggle. And it means that no matter how good you are, there's always a way in which you can improve, and that is by way of pushing yourself towards better things. Implications are not just in the game, not for that curriculum, but for life. But here's another question, right? If that's the case, then all of these levels and how many levels you completed are actually promoting fixed mindset. We're doing the same thing that the school is doing. We're rewarding just how many things you're able to solve over and over again, right? And so another thing I want to tell you about is the algebra challenges, perhaps the most exciting things we've done in the educational space. This game is designed by a brilliant school teacher from Norway, who I think is actually here, and he will be talking about the algebra challenge as well tomorrow on Thursday. So the game basically starts with pictures. So in this case, you're dividing by a tomato, and you want to make this box be alone. The box alone meaning is equivalent to solving for x, right? So in this case, I need to divide by mosquitoes, cancel the mosquitoes, and now the box is alone. Okay? What's interesting is that we start with this, but in the end, the game has scaffolding all the way up to here. Okay? So now they're able to solve highly complex linear equations from knowing nothing. And the question is, how successful is this going to be in a real-world setting? So in this case, the first one, algebra challenge we conducted was June last year. We asked, can kids in Washington State solve 250,000 of equations? They solved 390,000 equations. But here's the shocking outcome. Any kid that played for an hour and a half during those 5 days, these are the percentages of kids that reach 100% mastery on that particular concept. Okay? On average, we're at 93% for the entire K-12 spectrum on a concept that takes about a month to teach in 7th or 8th grade, depending. Okay? Ignore the kindergartner because there's only 2 kindergartners there. That's not statistically significant. So we continue to do this in Norway. Way greater population played. Almost 9 million equations solved. Very similar outcomes, 93%. And then subsequently in Minnesota. So let me just tell you some of these other outcomes. That if you look at all the kids that reached mastery, and you look at how much work they needed to do, what you see is that there's almost 6 times more problems that some kids needed to solve than others. So that means unless you have 6 times more content for some kids than others, you're never going to get to these 90% mastery of kids. If you look at it in terms of time, it's even worse. Some kids needed almost 10 times more time, which means that not only do you need to have that much more content, but you need to have engagement that will want them to do this for 10 times more time than what would necessarily be required. What you see here is that pretty much the parameters actually persist across these widely varying populations in 2 states and 1 country. If you look at how the drop-off of mastery comes down with respect to the number of levels required on average, you see that you would expect this curve to be extremely steep, right? At 7th grade, kids can do it, but before it's hard. But what you see is this is pretty flat. It's pretty incredible that the kids in the elementary school don't need that many more levels, problems, if they're specifically crafted through this adaptive process that I described to you. So what are the big outcomes in Norway? More than 5% of Norwegian school-ready kids now know how to solve complex linear equations after just that 1.5 hours for that 5-day period. What's even more interesting is that 42% of all work is done after school. Here's what it looks for in Washington. You can see basically school hours and huge number of activity. Here's how it looks in Norway. Okay? So almost half of the stuff done was voluntary by kids without their teachers present or asking them to do anything. Okay? Some of this has to do with the fact that Norway is very rich and they have actually computers at home, unlike people in Washington and Minnesota. But nevertheless, what this means is if technology is available and the engagement structures are right, you don't need to talk about homework. Homework will naturally happen. Okay? Minnesota, there were some other exciting things. Minnesota has a smaller population than Washington State, but there was a greater participation. What was interesting is we used the data from Norway and Washington to improve the algorithms towards Minnesota. And that's why I say thank you, Washington and Norway here. We increased the mastery now to almost 95%. And we reduced the time to mastery by 5% over Washington. Okay? We actually don't know where the limit of that is. And of course, if you have these adaptive algorithms, the point is they can keep improving with every new kid that participates. Now we're actually organizing a challenge in Brazil with potentially 42 million kids participating. We're also, as I pointed to you, with word problems, we're actually doing a word problem solving challenge in Washington State, and then we're hoping to do it with the OSTP, White House's organization, through the whole center. And finally, now that I'm done with the education part, I want to tell you about NanoCrafter briefly. There are roughly 50 to 100 people in the world who do this kind of synthetic biology research right now. Can we increase this scientific population from 50 to 50,000? That's one of our goals. We don't know. The game is designed towards creativity, creative design. Foldit was more about 3-dimensional puzzles. This is about how can you create new mechanisms, all right? And as you know, a lot of our kids are more creative than adults. And so the question is, can we have scientific journal articles produced by middle school kids? And finally, how can we develop these mechanisms for collective creativity? How can we have many people working and creating creative things that no single person can do? Here are sort of the ways in which the key obstacles that I pointed out at the beginning we're trying to address with NanoCrafter. This week, we have the first challenge ever in the beta that we're releasing. It's specific to this conference, and you're the first ones hearing about it, so you have a chance to win this week's contest if you participate. I can briefly show you the game if this will work. Yeah. Okay, so the fundamental mechanism is to free the star, and the idea is to actually construct the mechanisms. In this case, you have two pieces that you've built together such that when you put it in reality, in the water, the two reactions happen and the star becomes free. And now, what you can do is you can create much more complex mechanisms. In this case, this particular structure, way harder than what I just showed you, can solve a square root over an arbitrary number. So we can do arbitrary computation on DNA. This particular thing has just been published. This structure is a walker. So this is a track, and there is a walking structure that can transport molecules from one part of this track to another. So you can see how you can not only build nano machines, nano robots in this space in a way in which we have reduced it to the smallest possible elements, where now this science, accessible only to 50 to 100 people, is now available to everybody worldwide. And so with that, I would like to point out that we're still pretty far away from this transformative change. But I think if we look at it the right way and set the objectives right initially, I think we can make significant strides towards the goals that I think we all really want to achieve with games. Thank you.